So welcome back to the second half of our evening tonight with Jericho Brown. Jericho will be joined on stage with Marianne Monson for an interview at this point. Marianne Monson is the founder and director of the Writers Guild of Astoria. She's also the author of 12 books, mostly historical fiction and history. Her focus is on women in history on the frontier. Her book, Frontier Grit, won the American Library Association Amelia Bloomer Award and the Silver Medal Review Award. She has an MFA in creative writing from Vermont College, and she teaches creative writing at Clatsop Community College. Marianne has worked very hard to make this event happen, and I hope you will join me in welcoming her and Jericho back to the stage.
Thank you.
Nice chair you got there.
The light.
Thank you. Hello? Yeah? We good? All
The light.
right.
Can you turn the light off?
Oh,
on?
yeah.
He's not gonna.
The light. Thank you. So it's not glary. Great. All right. Jericho Brown.
Marianne Monson.
Welcome to Astoria.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Still. So we met in 2019 at the Portland Book Festival. And it was before you won the Pulitzer. The tradition had just come out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember.
You were doing a pop-up reading at the art gallery.
And you were on the side with a lot of hair.
Yeah, that was me.
And I knew then we'd be friends.
Yeah. And I was like, I love him.
Oh, thank you.
But I can't just go up and say that. I'll sound really crazy. And I
think
want
you
him
went
to
up and
come
said
to
it.
Astoria. That was what I thought.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
And, here you are. So it's amazing. But I felt like so Twitter-pated. It felt like it was like when you go and ask somebody on a date, It kind of felt like that, like when you're nervous. I was really nervous.
You don't
But
have
you
to
said
be
yes.
nervous. I'm totally easy.
You said yes. I'm so glad you said yes. Yeah. Okay, so I loved that you read The Crossing at the beginning, and I enjoyed talking to you about that today while we were driving across the Astoria-Megler Bridge, because every time I read that poem of yours, I think of that bridge. And quite a few of your poems deal with rivers in different ways.
Yeah.
You've talked about Langston Hughes' poems that deal with rivers as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I kind of thought we could frame some of our conversation tonight around that image of a river. So rivers, of course, have a source.
Yeah.
You have a number of sources.
Yeah.
One of those is Shreveport, Louisiana.
Which is near the Red River,
Oh,
which
okay.
flows into the Mississippi. Yeah.
Okay. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how that source influenced you and influences your work.
Shreveport was really a great place to be from, I think, if you wanted to be a poet, because it was small enough where you could know people. People might know your last name in a place like Shreveport, and yet large enough where you had an understanding of how the rest of the nation was working in relationship to where you were. I grew up in a church where my pastor had been very active in the civil rights movement, was very close to Martin Luther King Jr., had been many times in church, beaten within an inch of his life by police. There was, at one point, they marched horses. I grew up at the Mount Canaan Missionary Baptist Church, and my pastor, who recently died of COVID, was a man named Harry Blake Jr. And the Reverend Harry Blake Jr. was so amazing because he was he couldn't help but be the biggest influence. He was a great preacher. He was wonderful to see on Sunday. Church was very important to everyone in Shreveport, no matter what your religion was. You sort of centered your life around it. And I think being introduced to archetype and mythology and that kind of thing through the church and through really great music and really amazing preaching, seeing people who had worked very hard all week present themselves with what they felt was some kind of dignity, the ways in which Black people spoke in church on Sunday morning. I think all of that had a lot to do with why I became a poet and why I was interested not just in story, but how a story gets told and how things come across. And I was always interested in the pomp and circumstance of church, the pomp and circumstance of high school, which seemed to me a very big performance all the time. The pomp and circumstance of family interaction, which also was very often very clear to me a performance. You know, the other wonderful thing about Shreveport is it's a place where the houses have porches. And there are times of year where you're certain to have older people sitting on the porch. Maybe they're shelling peas or doing nothing at all, but they're always telling stories. And because I was close to my grandmother and because I lived in a neighborhood where play meant running all over the neighborhood, I would always hear these stories, and you could stop. I mean, it was a very different time. You know, people, maybe they knew you or maybe they didn't, but if some people were sitting on their porch, if you were 7 years old, you could walk up to that porch and sit there, and nobody would say anything to you about it. Isn't that strange? It's so weird now, right? But that was the way it was, you know, and then, you know, you sit there and, you know, finish your popsicle or something and then go to the next porch. So, and I think that has a lot to do with why I'm a poet.
Yeah. I think that when you teach and when you read, you invite your audience onto the front porch with you. You know?
I hope so.
That's something that happens.
I hope so.
I think so. Another source, and you mentioned it just there, was growing up in the Black Baptist Church. Can you talk a little bit about the way that plays out in your poetry?
Yeah, I just think I had a sense, you know, when you go to church, the program's the same every Sunday. Like, you know when the call to worship is, you know when the A and B selection for singing is, you know when the preaching's gonna happen, you know when the offering's gonna happen. You really know when everything is, and yet you don't know how that's going to come off every Sunday. There's going to be, in spite of the fact that you know what's coming, the way you get it is going to be different every Sunday. And in our case, where we went to church every Sunday, every Wednesday night, all those rehearsals, you sort of knew what was going on. You just didn't know how. You knew what was going to happen, but you didn't know how it was going to happen. You know, sometimes the sermon, for instance, wouldn't be Pastor Blake. It would be a visiting minister, or it would be Pastor Blake, and he would do something you really would not expect him to do. I remember he had this one particular robe that was white, and it had gold trim. And for some reason, all the kids, like me and the other youth of the church, would always get excited. And we'd be like, "Oh, he wearing the robe today, y'all." You know what I mean? Like, you could tell we did not have a lot to do. So that is so I think something about that gave me an appreciation for form, for form and content, for understanding that in spite of form, there still needs to be surprise, for pattern and variation, and how to turn certain kinds of variations into further patterns. And the music of the church did that too. You know, being talented, being able to blend or harmonize or sing in a choir in a church was sort of expected in many ways. And so, which is crazy because I can't sing, but but you know, when it was time for me to sing my note in those choirs, I had to sing my note. I didn't have a choice, right? So I think something about that made me also feel like community, that it could just be built at any given moment, that you could, you know, I remember there were people who would come to choir practice, but then they wouldn't show up on Sunday. It's because they were, you know, they wanted to sing. They didn't want to go to church. Do you know what I mean? So I think that's some of what I got from the church. Yeah. I mean, I also, I don't have the same conception of God as I did then, and definitely not as many of the Baptists in that particular church did, or any of the, I grew up around a lot of Catholic people. Catholicism is obviously really huge in Louisiana. But my conception of God is not the same, but if I hadn't grown up in that church, I might not have any conception of God at all. I'm always grateful to have that.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask you a little bit about that because I understand that religion could had a very cruel impact on your life too, to some extent, right?
Yeah. I mean, religion gets dangerous when it is most interested in condemnation. And I think, some of y'all really need your condemnation, so please have it. Girl, get you some Satan, honey. Y'all, I don't need a Satan. No, but I understand a lot of y'all really. Carlton Pearson literally got a very popular preacher whose work I love named Carlton Pearson. He literally lost his church because he began to propose the fact that Satan was not the most important tenet of Christianity. Do you know what I mean? So I don't need a God whose job is punish me, and I don't need the specter of Satan whose job, I guess, is to tempt me at every turn. I do all of that on my own. So you know what I mean? So and I think that was really useful to me because it put me in a position where I had to take responsibility for my own life. Now, everybody needs to take responsibility for their own lives, but I think there's a different thing that happens when you want to be an artist and you begin to take responsibility for your own life. And then you have to stand up in what you want to do in a very different way. Because often when you want to be an artist, what you're standing up in is what everybody else is resisting.
Yeah.
They don't want you to do that. They have some fear of that. And sometimes you might call that fear a righteous fear because they just think you're going to be broke, and maybe you will. But you have to do what you love. And doing what you love includes an all-out creation of your own life. And that's what I believe in now. When I think about God making human beings in God's image, I think about human beings being imbued with the ability to create, to build our own worlds, to build our own realities. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, yeah. And that's what I believe about poetry, and that's what I believe about the power of the word. Every religion believes that there is power in what you say. And so when I'm writing, I really want to be reverent. Because I understand that I am making something happen when I make my poems, which is why I'm talking a little too much now, I'm sorry, but I'll just say this last thing, which is why people, I think, don't understand that when I write a poem, I'm discovering my subjects so that I can deal with those subjects within my own soul. I do not sit down thinking, now I'm going to go after the police. Or now I'm going to get my dad. Like, who does that? Do you know what I'm saying? That's not what it's about for me at all. It's about me reconciling my feeling about being a citizen in a nation that doesn't want my citizenship, or being a member of a family, a brother or a son, where I have at times been rejected, and yet wanting to be a part of that family, wanting to be a part of that nation. How do you put those two things together aside from cognitive dissonance? And my writing is what helps me understand how I'm living in this world, right? And when I say something I didn't expect to say in a poem, that's when I am under the moral call to do something about what I just said. If you say something you didn't expect to say in a poem, then you have a responsibility, I think, to say, wait, do I think that? And if so, do I act like it? Is that how I live? Do you see what I mean? Yeah.
So you're creating That was beautiful.
I really need to take this audience with me
Yeah.
everywhere.
We could arrange that.
I would love that. Just everywhere I go. Maybe y'all could go in shifts or something. I don't know. Some
We could work
organizing
it
around
out.
here.
We could work it out. So it sounds like you're saying that as you're creating the poem is also creating you.
Yes. Which is why I think it's useful not to come to the poem with intentions, because you cannot trust yourself to know what you need to fix.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because often I find, and this is the case with my students, my students come to the poem trying to fix the world. But one way to begin to fix the world is to fix the parts of the world that you are upset with within yourself.
Yeah. Actually, that really gets to something that I wanted to say about your work. And I mentioned this to you the other day in the car. I feel like your writing comes from such an intensely vulnerable and deeply personal space. And when I found your work, I just was so moved by it. And it challenges me as a writer to... I ask myself, am I being as honest as Jericho? I'm not. Like, I admit that. And I admire your bravery on the page, That's not a question, but I think the question is, does that ever become a burden, that level of vulnerability and that level of bravery that you bring to your work? And was that a process to be able to be that vulnerable on the page?
Oh, I think I just realized that in order I would have to lose. You know what I mean? I think part of what happened to me when I was first coming to poetry is I was trying to win. You know what I'm saying? And part of that just has to do with growing up, an American capitalist like everybody else. You know what I mean? You're under the impression I'm gonna be on top of and in charge of this poem. You know what I mean?
Dominate it.
Yeah, and in actuality, you have to let the poem be on top of and in control of you. And I began to see and understand, given what, not just through the process of writing, but given what I love to read, that my favorite writers, the poems I love, were poems that just risked a lot, that lost a lot, that gave a lot up. You know what I mean? And that on the other side of that was a good poem. And so I had to risk that the good poem would be worth whatever I lose.
Yeah.
And for me, the poems that I was able to write after that were indeed worth it, because I knew myself better. I understood what was important to me. I knew what my values really were, and I could shift what my values really were. Does that answer you?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
So no, it's not. I want to say that's not easy, but it's also for me the goal. While it's not easy, it's exactly what I want. Because I want to write the poems I want to read. One of the ways you know you're a writer is that you keep reading books and you like a lot of them, but for some reason you're still writing anyway. Why are we still writing poems why is anybody writing anything after we read Beloved?
That's true. Yeah.
And wait, let me go backwards actually, right? Beloved, I guess, came out what year? Is it a 1990 book, 92, 89? Somebody know? Something around there, right? Guess what? There was literature before Beloved.
There was?
Now, for me, that's actually hard to fathom. Do y'all understand? When I think about capital L literature, that includes Beloved. Do y'all follow what I'm saying? So every time you write a poem, every time you make a story, every time you finish a novel, you literally alter all of literature. And whether we know it or not, that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
We want to contribute. We want to add the thing. In spite of reading Beloved, we still feel like there's something we don't see. And we want to put it in the world. And I want to make the poems I need to read. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's it. We like you. So I remember one of my professors in grad school saying that when you're in the presence of the mastery of language that you know you can't achieve, that don't be discouraged, but use that as a star to guide you.
Yeah.
And your work is that for me and so many other writers.
Thank you.
That's not a question. That's a comment. There's a poem of yours that I really love that you didn't read. I'm wondering if you would read it for us.
No, I didn't bring my books.
You didn't read it. You didn't like Father. No.
I might know it, but
Yeah?
I could probably just. Can somebody bring me a book? Jed, do you see a book? It's in a
Heather.
book called
Heather's
Please.
bringing it.
Thank
It's
you,
in
Heather.
Please. Yeah.
I know Jed's like, what? I'm doing my job.
We both forgot
You
books.
told. I know it's so funny. You were like, I have books in case you forget. I have books in case you forget. And
They're
you
all
both
backstage.
forgot. Oh, look,
Thank
books.
you.
Thank you. You did great.
Thank
That's Jed. He's really cute behind his mask. So I'll read this poem for Marianne.
you. Okay.
Like Father, my father's embrace is tighter now that he knows he is not the only man in my life. He whispers, remember when, and I love you, as he holds my hand hungry for a discussion of Bible scriptures over breakfast. He pours cups of coffee. I can't stop spilling. My father's embrace is firm and warm now that he knows. He begs forgiveness for anything he may have done to make me turn to abomination as he watches my eggs scrambled, soft. Yolk runs all over the plate. A rubber band binds the morning paper. My father's embrace tightens, grits stiffen. I hug back like a little boy, gripping to prove his handshake. Daddy squeezes me close, but I cannot feel his heartbeat, and he cannot hear mine. There is too much flesh between us, two men in love.
Thank you. So I hear so many things in that poem. I hear your emerging sexuality, your understanding of it, how that may have impacted your father, your relationship with your father, which it comes up, your relationship with your father, or your work. I also hear the violence that can come into play sometimes along the edges of love.
Mm-hmm.
And you bring those two into conversation in that poem in ways that I find deeply moving. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about bringing disparate, contradictory elements. I'd say that's a distinctive style of your work in general. Can you talk a little bit about any of that?
I just always want my poems to be like life. I figured early on that poems must have been different from greeting cards, from Hallmark cards. Hallmark cards get at one side of one emotion, which is why we only need them on special occasions, right?
Yeah.
You have to be able, and it's important, I think it is important to have a day where you tell your mother only good things, or a day where you tell your father only good things, or other holidays too. Do you know what I mean? Like where your love is not complicated, like Valentine's Day. Do you know what I'm saying? But every other day, love is actually much more tinted and colored and complex than any Hallmark card would make it. And I've always wanted my poems to be like my life, to be as complex as people are, when I think about what poems are like, you know this about me, when I think about what poems are like, I think much more about trees than I do anything that is static or not moving. I think, do you understand what I mean? I think every time, when you look, everybody in this room has a tree. Isn't that amazing? I say it and you think of your tree, you know what I mean? And it might not even be a tree you actually own that's in your own yard, and maybe it's a tree that you hid from somebody behind, or maybe you kissed under it, but it's still your tree, and it's the tree you think of automatically when I say you're a tree, right? And I think that's my relationship to poems. You don't look at a poem, I don't look at a poem, and I don't look at a person and say, what do you mean? Do you know what I mean? I don't look at a tree. I don't look at the water. I don't look at things of beauty and try to explicate them. I appreciate them as things of beauty. You follow me? Mm-hmm. So I think what happens when I'm writing a poem is that every time there's a little grit, I want a little delight. Every time there's a little violence, I want a little tenderness. Mm-hmm. Every time there's a little love, I want a little hate. And so I'm very consciously at first, and maybe more unconsciously now, because I've gotten in the habit of it, I'm looking for images that mirror one another in an opposite way, and yet mirror one another exactly, right? Because I know that all of those things can live within us at one time, because I want my poems to be real.
So your name, Jericho, is not the name that you were born with. And I think Jericho in the Hebrew Bible is this oasis, and it's a city that was promised to God's people, and Joshua showed up and they marched around the city, and then they blew the shofar trumpets, and then the walls came falling down. So I'm just curious how that became your name and how that suits the identity that you've grown into.
Yeah, it's really funny because I really, I didn't know if they were gonna let me in to give the reading, because my vaccination card says Nelson Demery. And I said, they're gonna look at me like, why are you showing us somebody else's vaccination card? You know what I mean? And things like that happen to me. Sometimes it's hard to get into a hotel room. I started seeing my poems in print, and I don't know why. It probably wouldn't now, but at the time when I first started seeing poems in magazines, I was so grateful, and almost as soon as I was happy about it, I felt as if I was sharing something I didn't want to share with my dad and with my granddad, because I'm a third, which is a great thing to do to a kid. And that's sweet. It's so nice. It's so thoughtful and loving. It's not about you at all. There was a way that I wanted to be able to write my poems in a way that if my family came up in my poems, I needed to say what I needed to say without feeling like I was betraying anyone. That's not, I wanted to write about my family, because I didn't. But if my family came up, I wasn't gonna stop that from happening. Do you see what I mean? So if my family came up, I didn't wanna feel like I was betraying anyone. And I was at a certain kind of precipice in my life where I was changing everything. And I really was doing a lot of work in self-creation and reinvention, And one of the ways that I felt that I could make that work official for myself was by changing my name. But I didn't do, I remember I was going to the Cave Canem poetry workshop, and I would tell my friends, I'm thinking about changing my name, and they would all laugh at me. Like, what about Nelson? How about that name? And I'll never forget that. And at one point I was gonna change my name to Rooster, which I still think is a great name, but they were all against. All my poet friends was like, that's a bad idea, so I didn't do it. But then, not that summer, but the next summer, I had this dream that I was in a waiting room, and the waiting room was really crowded. And the woman behind the desk who was calling names to go through the door just beyond her got to the name Jericho. She just kept saying the name Jericho. and nobody was getting up, and it was getting on my nerves in the dream, you know? I was like, oh my God, it is hot in here, you know? And so I said, I'll be Jericho. And I got up to go through the door, and then I woke up. And that same night, I met somebody who asked me my name. And when they asked me, I lied and said Jericho. Really, because they were trying to get my phone number. And you know, sometimes, y'all have done this before, never mind. But when I said my name was Jericho, he said, oh, so you're straightly shut up. And I said, what? And he said, Jericho. It literally translates straightly shut up, and it's loosely translated defense. And some people translate it good smelling because of the rows of Jericho around this. And he gave me this whole history and geography lesson all at once. And I'm like, what are the chances I have this dream and then I meet this person all in the same day, you know? And so then that's when I decided on it. I grew up with some people whose last name were Brown. One of my best friends, his last name is Brown, you know, that I grew up with. One of my line brothers, my fraternity brothers, who was my roommate in college, somebody I sung with in choirs when I was growing up, who I went to church with, Shanetta Brown. So I had a lot of friends who just happened to have the last name Brown, so I just decided Jericho Brown. And I never went back. Yeah. Y'all are sweet.
When I hear the word Jericho, I think of the sound of walls falling down. That's what it sounds like to me.
Good,
you
I'm
know?
glad.
Yeah, but I love knowing the story behind it. That's great.
Yeah.
So,
the first part of that story is that there's a great deal of silence, though. You know, you have to tell an entire people, a nation of people, to be quiet for days straight before those trumpets blow. And there's something about that I always want to remind myself of, that before those walls can come down, there's, you know, meditation and silence and retrospection.
In the poem The Crossing that I told you that reminds me of Astoria, there's a line that says, I'm set on something vast. And you talk about leaping, which is such a joyful image. What is that vastness that you're set upon?
Oh, that's a hard question. I don't know if I can answer it. You know, I actually, when I was writing that poem, I thought it was actually much more dire than I think people's reading of the poem is. People's reading of the poem is that it's quite joyful and ecstatic. And when I was writing the poem, I was feeling like, oh, this is a very sad poem. The speaker of this poem is jumping over that bridge. That doesn't sound good to me. But other people seem to get inspired by it. So it's hard for me to say, actually, what that vastness is, because I think what happens when you're writing a poem is if you lose your mind, which is your job, if you lose your mind to language, if you lose your mind to the sound of language, then sometimes you can end up saying things that have better meaning for others than it even does for you. And you probably even know this as a writer, even as a novelist, not through poetry. Sometimes you'll write a little scrap of something and it won't work out. It doesn't lead anywhere, it doesn't go anywhere. And then, you know, if you keep up with that little scrap of something, years later, without thinking about it, you'll write another little scrap of something. That seems to have nothing to do with that scrap from years before. But if you keep up with all your scraps, you realize this scrap was just sitting around waiting for you to have the experiences necessary to live into this other scrap. And then you put these scraps together and your poem's done.
Yeah.
Do you understand what I'm saying? And I think it would be hard. Sometimes I have a hard time talking about direct and exact meaning. You probably saw that this morning. One of the students asked me, what does this mean? And I was like, I don't know. Because I feel like I have an idea, but then I don't like saying, because then I feel like because I wrote the poem, I clamped down the meaning away from everyone else, which is not my job as the poet. My job as the poet is to write the poem, and then your job as the reader is to make use of it in your own body and soul and mind, right? Yeah.
So with that in mind, actually, I'm going to ask you to play a game that you asked me to play earlier today.
I cannot wait. I don't even remember it. I can't wait.
So I'm going to say the word poetry, and I'm going to ask you what its opposite is.
Oh, that's interesting. The opposite of poetry is death.
What else?
More opposites?
You put a lot on the board. You need a whiteboard?
Yeah, I would, and Sexton said suicide. She said after all, too. Suicide is, after all, the opposite of poetry. Isn't that something? She killed herself,
That's the vastness.
Yeah.
But the opposite of is poetry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would say death, I would say suicide. So, I just think any system, I really think the opposite of poetry is any system of values that allows you to put production over actual living or property over life. Do you know what I mean? We're always in this position, I think, where we're doing, but not feeling. Over and over again asked not to feel, or telling others not to feel, or told not to feel, when there's a lot we're experiencing that if we don't feel it fully, it will come out in some way that is absolutely horrendous and shameful, So maybe that's what I think of as the opposite of poetry. It's the opportunity. Poetry is the opportunity to feel and to feel better. And when I say feel better, I mean to feel all the feelings better. I don't mean just to feel good,
And so what are some of the synonyms of poetry?
I would say feeling, I would say life, I would say, I would just say understanding, kind of acceptance, kind of understanding. I feel like we gain that from poetry. I also just think education and learning. A lot of what I know about anything comes from my reading. A lot of what I know about science, about history, I didn't read science, I didn't read history per se.
Yeah.
You can find out something about everything in poetry.
So could you talk a little about the bravery that it takes to produce a creative work, right? And to devote your life to creativity? Because I think there's a leap there that everybody has to take. When did you know you were going to take that leap?
That's a great question. I think I'm so glad that I was a little crazy. I was always doing things toward I was supposed to be a lawyer. But then I would do something like not take the LSAT. Do y'all know what I mean? My dad would be like, "You haven't taken the LSAT?" I'd be like, "Isn't that something?" Do you know what I mean? Because I knew what I didn't want to do, so I just wouldn't do what I was supposedly supposed to do. And instead, I would spend a good deal, although I wouldn't name it that, I wouldn't say that I was studying to be a poet or I wanted to become a poet. I knew that something in me kept doing that in a very intense way. So I sort of put myself in this position where I had no choice but to take a leap because I hadn't applied to school. You know what I mean? Or I hadn't taken the LSAT. I remember there's this man who went to our church. My dad talked to him, and he figured out a way for me to apply to this law school and to take the LSAT late and for them to look at it late. This whole thing, and I was like, damn, I can't get away with nothing. But so that, I think that was part of it. Sometimes I think I had it a little bit easier than other people would have it too. Being kind of the black sheep in my family made making the leap easier for me. Everybody was already mad at me anyway. You know what I mean? Like, it ain't like I could make them happy. Do you know what I'm saying? So I think that was useful too. But really the other thing is just that I didn't want to do anything. I realized just through watching the world and experiencing things that I could end up being someone who did things halfway. And I just didn't want to be that person. I didn't want to die I didn't want to die closeted. I didn't want to die dabbling in poetry. I didn't want to die half falling in love. And do you know what I'm saying? Like, I wanted everything I had to be whole. And I realized, the things I want, I have to really give up a lot to have. And I'd rather die that way, knowing that I tried. Do you know what I'm saying? So I don't know, I can't pinpoint that to a moment. But I can say that little by little it became very important that I saved my life. I really was, when people say poetry saved my life, I think sometimes people think you're being kind of cliche, but I mean, it really did save my life. I remember a teacher named Rudolph Byrd showed me the poems of Essex Hemphill, and I read them and I fell in love with them. And he gave me those poems on a day when I was going to go kill myself. And I said, it's crazy. This sounds so crazy, but it's so true. I said, well, I should read the rest of Essex Hemphill's poems before I kill myself. I should at least do that, and then I'll kill myself. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and I spent, y'all are sweet. But then I spent the next few years trying, because his poems were everywhere. They were uncollected because his family would not collect the poems because he was gay and they didn't want anything to do with his poems. They wouldn't reissue his books. And so I literally was doing things like, I was in E. Ethelbert Miller's office at Harvard University in the library because he had these unpublished manuscripts of Essex Hemphill in a filing cabinet. And I had heard about it. And I was like, I just need to read these poems. Like, I was on the search for all of the Essex Hemphill's poems. I wish I had a cell phone then. They didn't exist in the same way. So I couldn't take pictures or anything. So I would be there like trying to recopy the poems. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then after that, somewhere along the way, I found another poet. And I was like, well, just read this before I kill myself, And then I went to Cave Canem. I was like, I better go do that before. And there was always this thing in me that thought, you're just kind of like using this poetry thing to get by, but you're going to kill yourself. And sooner or later, I just forgot that I was trying to kill myself. I wanted to write poems. I wanted to be a part of that world that was keeping me alive. You know what I mean? So yeah.
I'm glad you found the poem. And I want to say that, part of what just touched me so deeply when I saw you reading at the Portland Book Festival is I think there's a certain kind of awe when you are watching someone do the work that they were put on this planet to do. And that's how I felt. I think that's how so many people feel.
Oh, I'm glad you are changed. This is getting too emotional. Oh my goodness.
Let's take a couple questions from the audience because there were some really nice questions here. Okay. When you become poet laureate, what will be your mission?
When I become poet laureate. Have you seen my Twitter? Not becoming poet laureate. I started working with the Wine Wright Foundation, and maybe if I was poet laureate, I would, stop whatever has stalled is happening. What I'd really like to see is more poems in clinics and hospitals. People like to talk about the healing power of poetry. And, when you're waiting on a diagnosis, no matter what that diagnosis might be, I wonder what life would be like if you were waiting on a diagnosis and there was a poem right there on the wall, right? Nothing against, pictures of the seaside, you know what I mean? But, you could have a poem there, too. Do you follow what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know how many of you are clubbers, but I still am probably, but I really was. I love the club, I love to dance. And when you leave the club, somebody that's a part of some well-meaning and good organization will give you a little baggie with lubrication and condoms. They pass them out. you know? And it wouldn't be interesting if when you got that baggie, and that baggie was also a little poem. Do you know what I mean?
A love poem?
All sorts of poems, so I think I would want to do something like that, where I would also like for doctors, I think in Scotland, as a matter of fact, when you finish medical school, you do get a little book of poems. And I would love for it to be that way in the United States, that there's more exposure to poetry in health and medical fields somehow. I think maybe I would be interested in that. And then there are some other things that I think about doing that I could probably, maybe I don't need to be poet laureate to do, because I do think about how do I get this started, but I don't think about it in that context. But I guess if I was poet laureate, it might be easier to get it started. Like, I wish there was a way I wish there was a day to pay people, you know, in National Poetry Month, even just for one day. You know, so many people are on corners holding signs, but what if they were holding a poem?
Yeah.
And what if instead of whatever they make for panhandling that day, we were able to pay them that to hold that poem? You know, what would that do to a passerby? You know, so I'm interested. You know, poems on buses are great. Poems or trains are great.
Yeah.
But then I want us to actually look at who we don't want to see.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And then, so when I think about things like workshops, it seems to me, maybe this isn't the case everywhere, but wherever an MFA program is, it always seems to me kind of isolated from the rest of the world or the rest of the community where it is. And I'm not sure that MFA students want it to be that way.
Yeah.
And so I would love for there to be opportunities for them to teach in communities that were somehow mixed, you know, senior citizen. You know, we talk a lot about teaching in the prisons, for instance, which I obviously think is a great idea and has been very valuable to me to do that kind of work. But it would be really nice to teach a workshop where prisoners are sitting next to people who are not prisoners.
Yeah.
What would that do, not just for people's poems, but just for their empathy? Do you know what I mean? So I think about things like that all the time.
You could always partner with a literary nonprofit.
Yeah. Do
I
you
do.
know of any?
I don't know. I'll have to think about that.
Yeah.
You'll be a good poet laureate. I'm excited for
I'll
that.
be the best one.
Here's another question from the audience. What was your reaction to learning that you won the Pulitzer Prize?
Oh, I cried and I screamed and I messed up my wall. So I kept hitting the wall, and it was not the best wall to be hitting. And I called. The phone was ringing a lot, but I talked to the woman who was the provost at my undergraduate college, because she was always a very important person, very supportive of me. And I talked to my sister. I talked to a bunch of reporters all over the world, but I just remember talking to my sister and talking to a few people in particular, because I felt like really I was bringing it to them.
Yeah.
You know?
To your NIM.
Yeah.
Thanks for that word.
Yeah.
I like that word.
Definitely.
What inspires you most? Nature, people, injustice, other writers?
It's hard to delineate where your inspiration. I mean, I think Stevie Wonder inspires me most. You know, maybe Diana Ross. Diana Ross put out an album today that's like #3 on iTunes. She's 77 years old. I find that fabulous. I mean, ABBA put out an album today too, I think, or recently, and their album's like #1 on iTunes. They're all 99 years old. Anyway, I think that's a big deal. You know, I mean, I think that is inspirational. You know, like, I mean. Exactly. Tina Turner recently getting put in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But, you know, I think I really am inspired by people who do things for the love of doing it and not because they have to do anything. Have to do it. They have to do it because they have to do it, but not because they're trying to, like, prove anything to anybody. That always turns me on. But I wouldn't be able to, like, know, like, how much that inspires me any more than the trees that I'm going to see or any of the landscape that I'm going to see as I drive to the airport tomorrow. You know?
Yeah.
I want to say this about winning the Pulitzer. I didn't say, you know, the question of what I did when I won the Pulitzer, the reason why that's the answer is because I won the Pulitzer in May of 2020. So it's not like I could go anywhere. I just wanted y'all, I didn't want y'all, like y'all, I felt like people were like, why didn't you have a beard? But there were no beards. I mean, there were, but they, you know, I'd have to go to the grocery store. You know what I mean? I wasn't gonna have them with anybody. So, which is the best thing that ever happened to the Atlanta Police Department. Because I would hate for the Atlanta Police Department, because they would have had to arrest me. And I'm serious, because if I mean, God is so good. Mm-hmm. If I had won the Pulitzer Prize and it had not been COVID, can you imagine the fool I would have acted? I can. And then
would have been a party.
And the police would have had to arrest the most recent Pulitzer Prize winner of poetry, because I would have been walking down the street naked. I got a crazy person, don't romp. Anyway, sorry. I just had to say that because people were like, that's the most boring Pulitzer story I've ever heard in my life. It wasn't my fault. Anyway, but it was good. It was good.
And you found out by watching TV, like what?
Yeah, I was watching the announcement of the Pulitzer so I could be mad about whoever won.
Yeah.
I was just like, Jennifer Chang is gonna win and I'm gonna not like her anymore. No, she didn't even have a book out.
All right, this last question is from the audience also, and they say, are we all always a work in progress? Are you?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I mean, there's no way around that. But if we're working in progress, somebody's got to be doing that work.
Yeah.
It never ends. You have to be doing that work. You have to be searching. You have to be figuring it out, and you have to be trying new things. You have to. I mean, you don't know who you are if you're not in experiences that tell you. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know, like sometimes I make this joke where I say, oh, I'll do anything for a poem. And then I'll say, right after that, I'll say, well, probably not anything, but I don't know.
Could try me.
Do you know what I'm saying? I don't know. Sometimes I'm glad I don't know. Do you understand what I'm saying? So you have to be willing to be in the world in a way that enthralls you, that keeps you alive. You know, no matter what your age is or what you've already experienced, you know. Rita Dove just put a book out this year called Playlist of the Apocalypse. And I was interviewing her about the new book, and it's got some really great poems in it. And you know, Rita Dove had like Barack Obama put medals on her. You know what I'm saying? And there's just something about that that's really particularly inspiring to me, because I just want to always be trying to get to another level or find out something new about myself. I think the other thing that was really inspiring to me is Rita wrote that book after finding out that she had multiple sclerosis, and that she literally had to relearn how to move, how to write, how to use her hands. That's really amazing. As a person who's had the health issues that I've had recently, like, oh, I'll be all right. Like, I can still take the journey no matter what. So yeah, of course. I think so. Yeah. I hope so. Because like what happens if you achieve everything? You want to die?
Jump off the bridge?
Yeah, that's just so boring.
Yeah.
Yeah, you gotta live. You gotta live, yeah.
Jericho, thank you so much for taking us down this river with you.
Thank you so much. This is great. Thank you. Y'all are great. Y'all are wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, they stand up here, baby. Thank you.